In this video series, we've been talking about opioid addiction and the factors, both biochemical and environmental, that can contribute to the development of an opioid use disorder. In this installment, we're going to explore how opioids stimulate dopamine production in the brain. We'll also look at the role that opioid receptor proteins play and how they're linked with an individual's risk of developing an opioid use disorder. We produce opioids in our brains. Well, I guess more accurately, we produce natural opioid molecules, like endorphins, in a gland at the base of our brains, called the pituitary gland. Once produced, these natural opioids are transferred to a region of the brain called the ventral tegmental area. This ventral tegmental area is located in the midbrain, and that's where dopamine is produced. You may remember from a previous video that dopamine is a key neurotransmitter molecule that, among other things, motivates our behavior. When we engage in certain behaviors and as opioids interact with the ventral tegmental area, dopamine gets released. The dopamine then moves to a part of our brain called the nucleus accumbens. And as dopamine interacts with the neurons associated with the nucleus accumbens, it kickstarts a cascade of neural connections that ultimately provides us with intense feelings of satisfaction, pain relief, and even euphoria, depending on the event and how much dopamine is involved. If that's our brain's natural reward pathway, what happens when we take synthetic or pharmaceutical opioids? Well, synthetic or pharmaceutical opioids work using the same pathway. They're absorbed into our bloodstream, then they travel to the ventral tegmental area of the brain. As they interact with the ventral tegmental area, dopamine gets released. Dopamine then travels to the nucleus accumbens and, well, you know the rest. The greater the dose of synthetic opioids taken, the greater the feeling of satisfaction, pain relief, and euphoria that's experienced. Now, you may recall in our last video that we identified a gene that may make someone a little bit more likely to become addicted to opioids. It's the OPRM1 gene, or the opioid receptor mu1 gene. This gene produces a transmembrane opioid receptor protein that interacts with opioid molecules, regardless of whether they're natural opioids like endorphins or synthetic opioids. In order to explain how opioid receptors are linked with dopamine production, let's take a bit of a detour. Dopamine is produced in the brain by special neurons called dopaminergic neurons. Let's just call those dopamine-producing neurons for simplicity. Most of the time, those dopamine-producing neurons are actually not producing that much dopamine. Why? Well, dopamine is a molecule that's associated with behavioral reward and with pain relief, so you don't need to produce high levels of it all the time. Dopamine-producing neurons are typically bombarded with a molecule called gamma aminobutyric acid, or GABA for short. This interaction with GABA is what ultimately causes the suppression of dopamine. So, where does GABA come from? Well, GABA is produced from neighboring GABAergic neurons. We can just call those neighboring GABA-producing neurons for simplicity. The GABA travels from the GABA-producing neurons to the dopamine-producing neurons and halts dopamine production and dopamine release. So, in order to produce and release dopamine, GABA needs to somehow be inhibited. But how? Well, a GABA-producing neuron features a whole bunch of receptor proteins across its cell membrane, and those are called opioid receptors, such as the OPRM1 When opioids bind to the OPRM1 receptors, those receptors send a signal into the GABA-producing neuron to temporarily halt GABA production. Less GABA production means less GABA export. Less GABA export from those GABA-producing neurons means less GABA interaction with dopamine-producing neurons. Less interaction with GABA by those dopamine-producing neurons means more dopamine production. All right, let's get back on track. Now, this is important. Not everyone has identical opioid receptors. Because your OPRM1 gene might be just a couple of nucleotides different from my OPRM1 gene, that could mean that your opioid receptor proteins are a little bit better, or maybe a little bit worse at binding to opioid molecules. If your opioid receptors are a little bit better at binding to opioid molecules, then you might be a little bit more likely to develop something like an opioid use disorder following an opioid prescription regimen. I should also say here that not all synthetic opioids are the same. Opioid is just a class of molecules. It includes just about anything that will interact with those opioid receptor proteins produced by the OPRM1 gene. Synthetic opioids include medications like Vicodin, oxycodone, morphine, codeine, fentanyl, methadone, tramadol, among others. Some of these are more addictive than others. It kind of depends on how fast acting they are and how readily they'll bind to those opioid receptor proteins. For most of us, high levels of synthetic opioid intake can have very real and very long-lasting impacts on that ventral tegmental area of the brain. As someone engages in prolonged synthetic opioid use, they end up requiring higher and higher doses of synthetic opioids in order for that ventral tegmental area to produce the sufficient levels of dopamine just to feel okay. For someone with a severe opioid use disorder without synthetic opioid intake, dopamine production can be severely limited. And that can result in incredibly intense, very real, and sometimes even dangerous withdrawal symptoms. If you suffer from an opioid use disorder, please don't suffer alone. Reach out to your doctor, or you can call 1-800-662-HELP to reach the National Substance Abuse Helpline. That's 1-800-662-4357. They have people answering phones 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They can give you treatment referrals and information to help you move forward. You can also use that hotline if you have a friend or a family member who has an opioid use disorder to get resources to help you help them. I'll leave that number on the screen as the credits roll, and I'll see you next time.